Ms. Wein-Miller, when you're ready.
Thank you. I lost track of a couple of slides earlier. I knew I had, but now I figured out where they were. So let me digress back to that.
Where's your microphone?
Oh. How's that? Better? Okay. All right. I had earlier lost track of a couple of slides, and I knew I did it, but now I found them. So let me go back to talking about that window of opportunity. And I think I should correct myself. It appears it's 5 minutes and 30 seconds, not 4 minutes and 30 seconds. But in that time, Dan Brophy had to make 2 separate trips out to his truck, out to the corner of Southwest 17th where he was parked to unload the carts. And there are carts that you can see in Exhibit 216 there that have the pig in them. But it's unlikely, given the size of those carts, that he could roll 2 of them at the same time. But there are 2 that are present in those photos that you'll see. He had to empty that little piggy bank that you can see in this one, and there's a better photo of it later. But he had to get the money out of that pig, including this IOU that you can see here. This is one of the things that was in his pocket that the medical examiner found. There are the $1 bills. He had to go back into that large, deep storage room, get into the cooler, and then roll out that big rack that has the perishable ingredients on it. And that you can see in the corner of this kitchen, and this is the kitchen that his class was going to be working in for live fire that day. And then the ventilation, the lights, and then start the process of getting the coffee and the water going. So clearly that's something that would take several minutes and may well have taken that entire 5 minutes and 30 seconds. And remember, it's not a full 5 minutes and 30 seconds because that timestamp is when the van is seen a block away driving west on Jefferson. So now let me go back to where I was. All right, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the CSLI records. Next. So you heard from Delilah Marvell and from Nancy Brophy that there was a party out at their place, at the Marvells, at their woodland acreage in the summer of 2016. And that after that, Nancy and Dan Brophy realized that that area around Gales Creek, which is the general vicinity in which they have their land, out toward Vernonia, that entire part of the county just inside the coastal range would have everything that they desired. It had great access to Highway 26, which, as you all know, in the winter is a pretty reliable highway. It's wide and it's relatively safe, certainly much safer than some of the other highways that you can take coming back into Portland from the west. The coast is only about 40 minutes beyond that. It's flat, rich farmland. Until you get up into the coastal range, there's just some beautiful farmland out there with the Nehalem River running through it. You can get land at a good price. It's still a relatively inexpensive part of the city, or of the state, especially given in its proximity to Portland. It's definitely less expensive than getting into Yamhill County and Pinot Country, or getting too close to Hillsborough. It was a place that they could afford, a place that was close enough for them to stay connected to family and friends. Now, Nancy Brophy can't now tell you which days she went out there or where exactly she went. She can just tell you that after they went out to that party and she saw Dan light up, saw how much did he tell Delilah Marvell, you're living the life, that he was so happy that she thought, okay, this is the ticket. This is probably what we should really hone in on. And so she would explore. She'd just drive around, and she loved to get lost in her thoughts. And there are plenty of small roads that etch that area before you get into the Tillamook State Forest. The fact that public shooting range is in the Tillamook Forest does not tell you whether the tower that Ms. Gway and Mr. Roloff were testifying about is in the Tillamook Forest. The tower, as you can see, is quite some ways before. And you can tell that even though the elevation is starting to pick up there, There is absolutely no reason to believe, and I suggest to you that it's not true, that the tower itself is in the Tillamook State Forest just because the shooting range is. Ms. Brophy can't tell you for sure when she went to Vernonia, and she can't even tell you for sure that's what she was doing March 26th and 27th, because she doesn't know. She has not focused. She had no reason to focus on those days until just very, very recently. But her explanation for why she might have been meandering in that area makes a lot of sense. That would have been a wonderful, wonderful place for them to live. Ms. Guay also told you when she was here this last time that she made no attempt to ascertain how many times Nancy Brophy drove through those small towns outside of Vernonia. She was asked to focus specifically on the towers that were in Vernonia that would show that she got basically either into Vernonia or just short of it. But that she didn't look at all the many other towers that dot that area to find out whether Ms. Brophy had been driving around looking at properties and just sort of brainstorming about places that would work in those months. But she did tell you that what she looked at were records that only went from November of 2017 through June of 2018, and the Marvell's party had been a full, almost a year and a half earlier in the summer of 2016. So there was a lot of territory there to cover, and there was a lot of time to cover, many, many months that were just outside of the analysis that she was able to testify to you about. And in fact, she told you that she had at one point been asked to look to see what towers were closer to one of those other locations. I think maybe it was a Gales Creek location. I don't remember exactly what it was. She'd been asked to figure out whether there was a tower she could search or she could check against the records, but then there was no follow through and she was never asked to actually look at it. So you have very, very little information to support this contention that Ms. Brophy wasn't driving in that area doing exactly what she told you she was doing. And in fact, it makes more sense that she was doing exactly that. Because what Detective Merrill hypothesized, and even today, Mr. Overstreet said, as he was talking about this CSLI demonstration, that this idea that on March 27th, Ms. Brophy had gotten all the way out to that gun range and somehow learned to fire a gun. So even his own admission, his sort of self-deprecating comment was, we got a little crazy with it. Detective Merrill and I got a little crazy with that. But then he doubled down and said, he still thinks that's what happened, as crazy as that description was. It was cartoonishly crazy. It was ridiculous. That his hypothesis is that because that's the one time they can find Nancy Brophy's cell phone anywhere in the vicinity of that range, that what must have happened that day is that she raced from her home in Beaverton in her Toyota Sienna. She gets all the way out to North Fork Wolf Creek Public Range. She gets to the turnoff from Highway 26. She passes that tower, the one in question, and then she turns off Highway 26. So she has to get from the tower to the turnoff on 26. And then she has to drive down North Fork Wolf Creek Road, which you can see up there. 26 is the one that comes down at an angle across the lower right of the screen. And then as Mr. Roloff described, Mr. Stringer described to you, the intersection is actually back a little bit. But she had to get that far down the highway before she turned off on this obviously small and gravel road that snakes through the woodlands there up in the mountains. He had to drive all the way down that winding road to get to the public range. And Mr. Stringer told you that when he did that recently, even to get to the very first of those 4 ranges took him about 6 minutes. So let's say it's 5 minutes down 26 and then 6 minutes up to that range. What I believe Kelsey Guay and Josiah Roloff agreed on is that the CSLI data suggests that that time that she was past that tower, that she got into that vector that was pointing, generally toward the range or covered that space that included the range, that would have been 25 minutes, approximately 25 minutes. So if you assume, then that's a round trip, right? She's got to go 5 miles or, 5 minutes down 26 and 6 minutes up into the woods. And then she's got to double that back. That's 22 minutes right there of drive time. That gives her like 3 minutes to find the range, figure out what to do, get out of the car. If there's somebody else shooting, to tell them, please, please, would you mind stop shooting? Because I'd like to go put up a target for myself. I have to run down the range and I don't want you to shoot me while I'm doing that. And then she figures out how to get the clips into the gun and fires off all these shots. And presumably, because she actually wants to know now, I mean, indulge me, because I know this does sound crazy, but she wants to know whether she's learned to shoot well enough that she can stop practicing. She's got this nailed. She runs down to check the target again, and then she runs back to her car and shoots back down the road. And before long, she's in Northeast Portland having coffee or lunch with a friend. I mean, it's absurd to think that she's done all this planning, she's done all this preparation, and that's what she does to learn how to shoot. It's absurd. Maybe as a matter of physics that's possible, but as a matter of common sense, it's not. It makes much, much more sense that she was exploring the area that she hoped to inhabit before too long. So besides the fact that the evidence relating to the gun is just horribly insufficient to support a conviction, you've got no evidence that she could have accomplished the shots that killed her husband with that kind of incredible precision. I mean, remember what the medical examiner told you about that. Severed his spine, his aorta, his heart, a lung, and that's just one of the shots. And then the other one manages to take a parallel track going back the other direction. Again, goes through his heart. I mean, that's amazing, amazing precision. And there is no evidence that's presented to you that those were close range shots. They certainly were not. The medical examiner told you there was nothing in terms of damage to the skin or to the body that indicated that those were, such literally point blank shots that sort of precision would be perhaps imaginable. No, those shots were taken by somebody who knew exactly what they were doing, and they didn't learn how to do it by racing up to the North Fork Wolf Creek Range and firing shots off in 3 minutes on a cold spring morning and then hopping back into the car. So besides that insufficient evidence relating to guns and her ability to use a gun that capably, that incredibly capably, you heard all sorts of other conflicting accounts about her ability and her capability when it came to planning. Nancy Management Brophy is so organized that she planned a murder for months, and yet she forgot to drive to the scene incognito in a vehicle that wouldn't be recognized. No, she took the van that her in-laws had given her. She's so organized that she forgot to check for nearby cameras. Never occurred to her, with all the writing that she'd been doing in this sort of mystery suspense genre that she was in, romance writing, never occurred to her that there might be surveillance cameras, like maybe along the TriMet line that Jefferson follows right there. Nope. Didn't notice those cameras over on the PPB building across the street. Just didn't even occur to her that surveillance might have been a problem. So there she goes, driving a van that's clearly distinguishable. She's so organized, Nancy Management Brophy, that she overlooked how much safer and easier it might have been to accomplish this goal another way. Maybe while mushroom hunting in the woods, maybe on any number of other occasions. If you accept the state's hypothesis, totally unsupported by evidence again, that she actually was aware of the comp benefit, that somehow that would be helpful. Mushroom hunting in the woods is something he did for work sometimes. But no, she went to a place where she had been going regularly for years, that she even went for fun, for lunch with friends. A place where everybody knew her, where she was well recognized, driving a well-recognized van. And her deliberate planning went on for months and months, but she couldn't be bothered to wait the 5 more months it would have taken for that most valuable of the life insurance policies, that accidental death policy, to pass out of its contestability period. That would have happened in November of that year, but no, she just couldn't wait until November. Apparently now the suggestion is that that's somehow related to the fact that Dan was going to go back to teaching days, but certainly at some point he would have gone back to teaching weekends. But gosh, that was only $250,000. Why wait for that? She's motivated by insurance. She didn't care about the most valuable properties. And she knew that she could hide the purchase of the slide that she purchased on eBay if she just went back to the gun show. These gun shows apparently are happening once a month or once every 2 months or with some frequency that kind of surprised me, but she could have easily gotten back to a gun show, paid cash for the slide, didn't have to register it because that's not an operable gun. That's not a piece that has to be registered. There's no background check. Could have just paid cash for that. But instead, she opted not just to purchase it on eBay, but out of the same joint account with her husband, the OnPoint account. So there are a couple of other aspects of the CSLI that I think are just important to touch on briefly, but one is this idea that she had abandoned her husband's family. I understand where that came from, and I think that that was said to you in complete sincerity. But I do want you, I'm not going to play them for you now, I'm not going to put them up because you're going to get the unredacted versions, not the ones that we were looking at in court. We were trying to disguise the phone numbers, but you'll have the versions that actually have all that data in them. But look at the frequency of those contacts. Look at the frequency of those visits back and forth. They were in good contact that summer. They talked more than once a day. And that was going on, even though she's spending all that time in Texas. She's got all these other things going on, and all the people in her family who are, wanting and needing attention to work out those details and deal with their own pain. But she still was every bit as connected to Karen and Jack Brophy as she ever had been. And she had good contact with Nathaniel as well. So, a failure of memory, inadvertent, nothing to blame anybody for. It happens. It happens more and more as we age. So let's talk about memory. Of everything you heard about memory, and there was a lot being thrown at you, a lot of different conditions, a lot of different explanations, but the two that matter from our perspective, the only two that matter, are this concept of not attending that Dr. Riesberg talked with you about, and retrograde amnesia. We're not at all worried about anterograde amnesia, except the fact that I sometimes have trouble pronouncing it correctly, but that has nothing to do with this. That's memory going forward from whatever the shocking event is, and we're not talking about that. We're talking about retrograde amnesia, which means that a period of time immediately preceding the event gets wiped out, or at least partially wiped out. So retrograde amnesia and not attending are the two important concepts. And I'm going to ignore almost all of the rest of those, except that I just want to say clearly, disassociation and PTSD and the kinds of trauma therapies that Dr. Best was talking with you about that relate to PTSD, none of those are, I mean, to us, those are red herrings. Those are confusing the situation. And it's important to keep in mind that when the state criticizes the frequency with which these amnesia defenses come up, to understand that the vast majority of those are about like alcoholic blackouts or things that have nothing to do with this case. None of the blackout phenomenon, which of course does come up in a million different criminal cases for understandable reasons, disassociation, PTSD, none of those things have anything to do with what occurred here. What Dr. Riesberg was describing to you are those two concepts or two phenomena, two things that science has recognized do happen, of not attending and retrograde amnesia. Now, of the two of them, not attending is a fairly common thing. It really just means that you are concentrating so much on something that's important to you, that you're trying to accomplish it, that you kind of, it's like you've got blinders on. You sort of lose track of everything else around you. And then unless something really draws your attention, pulls you out of your reverie or this very high concentration state that you're in, you don't notice what's going on. And we all do that. I mean, to varying degrees, we all do that. In fact, that probably is what explains why Chef Damon didn't notice that morning that she was in the building with Dan Brophy for that long period of time. I just didn't pick up on the fact that they'd never exchanged pleasantries. She never crossed it in the hall. You know, that you look at the layout of that building and you know you're going to run into other people if they're in the building with some frequency, because there's that one central hallway that goes down. But, you know, she didn't notice that. She even, when she found the door open at what must have been at least 8:12 or so in the morning, that big bay door, she thinks that's weird, but she doesn't think, well, I should find Dan and ask him why he didn't close it. And then she gets to the back door to let the students into the student lounge. And again, she's just kind of like, I wonder why he didn't let him in. Doesn't go to find him because she was concentrating. She had her own class to teach and she was really focused on it. And so she was not attending. She was not paying attention to all of these other details and the potential significance of them. And I'm sure she felt horribly about that afterwards, but it's not something you should feel badly about, because we all do it. We all do it in varying degrees, and there are varying things that cause us to give something that much attention that we tune everything else out. But what Dr. Riesberg was explaining to you about that is, if you're not paying attention, if you're not attending to other details, they're not getting into your mind. They're not getting into your memory. You may actually not have noticed all these things, and so it wouldn't be later that you could give a perfectly complete account of everything that had been happening around you while you were not attending. If your concentration is narrow enough and focused enough, you really have just lost all of that. You never took it in. And that's important in this context, understanding what probably was happening with Nancy Brophy that morning. The retrograde amnesia, which would have then occurred later, the not attending period, would have been the time that she's thinking about this book, this trilogy. She's not gotten a great night's sleep. She's really been excited about this, but she's kind of been on overdrive excited about it now for almost a week. And then she goes down there and she's trying to work out some of these details so she can get this all onto paper and off to the agent, who then is going to present it to the publisher. And she's just focused as all get out on that. And then this horrible thing happens. And it is life-changing. It is absolutely life-changing for her. It is probably the worst thing that will ever happen to her. It's the kind of shock that most people don't experience in a lifetime, because most of us do have the opportunity to come to terms with the passing of a loved one. Very rarely does that happen in such a sudden and such a horrific way. So the pieces of that, and let me go back to the not attending. Well, no, I'll come back to that in a minute. So the pieces of that are so important to understand are that there are three factors that were described to you by Dr. Warford and Dr. Riesberg. It has to be extremely sudden. It has to be wholly unexpected. And it has to be very consequential and uncontrollable, right? And I think Dr. Warford used a term like negative valence, and Dr. Riesberg may have said that as well. But what they're talking about is just that the negative quality of what you have just learned, what has just happened, is so high and it's so uncontrollable and it was so unforeseeable that it causes a level of distress, a level of reaction that is very rare. And thank God it's rare. I mean, can you imagine if that sort of thing happened on with any frequency at all? But it takes that constellation of circumstances to cause retrograde amnesia. And when that happens, it's a failure of the brain to even capture and encode the memories of the events that occur shortly before that loss is recognized. It doesn't matter, of course, when it doesn't matter, for instance, in this case, when Dan Brophy was killed, that's not the operative time frame. The operative time frame is when she realizes that it's happened, right? So the brain as both Dr. Riesberg and Dr. Warford explained, there's a biochemical process and there's a mechanism at work that causes this. And essentially, in very simplistic terms, and I'm not nearly as eloquent as Dr. Riesberg, I know, but in very simplistic terms, the brain's flooded with adrenaline. It is so horrific. And that's, that's of course what gives us this flight or fight response, right? I mean, it's like, it's something that is released in a very, very emergent situation. And that adrenaline flood is so extreme that the body then responds to it by saying, whoa, this is, you need to calm down. This is chemically, this is really too much for the body. And so then cortisol washes over and takes over and tries to control the adrenaline. At least this is how I understood what he was explaining to you. And that combination of things so thoroughly permeates the brain that the brain doesn't actually retain and then encode those memories. And they described how there are a couple of different stages of memory, and it can interrupt all of those, but there's a chance that it even interrupts before it gets into short-term memory. That it's not just a disruption that occurs between short-term and long-term memory, but that it can be very immediate. So what Dr. Riesberg was explaining in terms of the general phenomena is that if you take the overlay of somebody who was not being very attentive because they had this very high degree of concentration to begin with, and they hadn't taken in everything that was going on, Ms. Brophy testified that one of the things she does remember from that morning, and she thinks it was that morning, she thinks this is an accurate memory from that morning, but one of the things she does remember is that there was a man working on a white car or a white vehicle that was near her, and at first, she didn't even notice that he was there, but after a while she started thinking, something about him is making me uncomfortable, and so she moved. Dr. Riesberg explained that those kinds of things that can break through your concentration are the bits of memory, those kind of, postcards, little pieces of memory that are most likely to come in because they were significant enough to break through the concentration. And that, I would suggest to you, is also consistent with that whole series of calls then that she has later when she gets home. And as she's gotten the dogs, we'll go back to that in a minute, but she gets home and she's working on her computer, and then she gets that first call from Maxine Borcherding. And then Mr. Hively explained to you the whole back and forth, the lengthy calls that she's having with her. It clearly has both of their attention because they're on the phone back and forth nonstop during that period. And then she has a call with Karen Brophy. They're both alarmed. My recollection is that that second call with Karen Brophy, the actual connection with Karen Brophy happens at OCI, not immediately afterwards at the house. But these women are all really worried about Dan. They're very alarmed. And so she does remember that series of events too before she gets down to OCI. But it's only those really, for lack of a better term, those alarming pieces of what happened that morning that jump out more clearly than everything else. Now, when Mr. Overstreet was talking with Ms. Brophy as she was testifying, he was trying to get her to give him more detail about what had happened. I think somehow thought maybe her memory could be refreshed and she would be able to fill in more of those blanks, or maybe he was just cynical and didn't believe that she was unable to fill them in. But as he pushed her and he pushed her and he pushed her, you'll notice that, and this happened in particular on the second day she was testifying, but when he pushed her and pushed her and pushed her, she started to acquiesce to what he was suggesting. She didn't always acquiesce, but she got to the point of exhaustion, and you could tell that she wasn't able to give him answers, but if she didn't know the real answer, she would agree with what he was suggesting had happened. That she would actually let him help her fill in some of those blanks with information that he was giving her. Now, she told you, remember, she's about to turn 72, that she's been getting up at 4:30 every morning that we've been here. So she's probably finding this experience even more taxing and even more exhausting physically than all of the rest of us are. But she gets up at 4:30 every morning and she comes here. And she is attentive. She does her very best. But that testimony took a day and a half, nonstop day and a half. And her mind did start to wander as she went further into it. But one of the examples that I want you to focus on of whether what she was saying, everything that she was saying was a real memory, whether it was accurate or whether she was just trying to give answers to questions, trying to fill in information that she didn't really know, had to do with that same CSLI that we were just talking about out near the North Fork Wolf Creek Range. Mr. Overstreet asked her when he was questioning her to agree that she had watched a video that morning of March 26th. He asked her specifically about March 26th, whether she'd watched a video about how to load a Glock that very morning before she drove out there, suggesting that she wanted to learn how to load the Glock that morning, and then she was going to go out to the gun range and use that newly acquired knowledge. Now, when Officer Sparling had testified some time ago, he told you there was some evidence she had watched such a video that morning. He did admit on cross-examination that it appeared that it had not been lengthy at all. In fact, I think he even conceded on cross-examination, although this wasn't drawn out, as I recall, on direct, that it had probably been just a second or two. It was a very, very short amount of time. But that's in the State's Exhibit 82. Now, Mr. Roloff had come in just, I think, 5 days before Ms. Brophy testified, and he had talked with you. He had testified about that same thing, and he had put together for us our Exhibit 339, which was responsive to State's Exhibit 82. And he did a number of things. He went back and looked for the videos that are listed on State's 82, but the Officer Sparling said he had not retrieved. He hadn't tried to look at. And we played those for you because we thought a lot of them were much more innocuous in the viewing than the name might suggest. You know, that there was this kind of fear-mongering quality to telling you that she'd looked at the videos, but the one that she'd watched for the longest period of time was basically a historical video about Glocks. Had nothing to do with how you might use one to actually shoot it. So Mr. Roloff, in the course of that testimony, also went through that that portion of State's Exhibit 82 where the suggestion had been made to you in the initial testimony that she had watched this video about how to load a Glock. Now, I agree with Mr. Overstreet that at some point that video must have been on the computer, or at least there must have been some brief link to it. We don't know that. You don't have any evidence about that, whether it was actually watched in whole. But what Mr. Roloff had told you just days before Ms. Brophy testified is that it had literally, there'd been dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of bookmarks or things, activity on the computer that had all synchronized up all in a row. And it's 10:13, I don't remember exactly what it is. I think it's 10:13, 35 seconds and 10:13, 36 seconds. And on our Exhibit 339, if you look at pages 3, 4, 5, and 6, you'll see on page 3 this video that he was asking Ms. Brophy about watching, about loading a Glock. You'll see that video, but you'll see that it's high up in the string of all this activity that happens within 1 second. So we all knew, except for Ms. Brophy, we all knew she hadn't actually watched that video on March 26th, that that was something the computer did all on its own. And yet, when asked about it, when he asked her to agree that she'd watched the video, she was just sort of like, yeah, I guess if you say so. She, in that acquiescence, that filling things in is something that happens when somebody doesn't have a memory. It's a natural tendency, but it doesn't mean that the information that the person is giving you is accurate. It also doesn't mean that the information that the person is giving you is untrustworthy for some reason that has to do with lying, right? We all know that there's a big difference between purposefully telling a lie and doing the very best you can with the information available to you to replace a memory to come up with an answer to a question. That's a natural human tendency. That's how the brain works. We try to be helpful. We try to use information at our disposal to try to provide answers, and that's what Ms. Brophy does. As many of you will remember, Donald Rumsfeld once famously explained that there are the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. There are the known knowns. There are the things we know we know. We also know there are the known unknowns. That is to say, we know, I can't do a perfect Rumsfeld imitation, I'm sorry. That is to say, we know that there are some things we do not know, but there are also the unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know. And it's the latter category that tends to be so difficult. Now, he offered this in the cusp, as an explanation on the cusp of our invading Iraq in 2002. But I mention it in this context because it does offer a framework for thinking through what you've learned about memory, what you know about memory from your own experiences. There is no question, and Dr. Riesberg told you this, but that an extremely sudden, a wholly unexpected, and a very consequential and uncontrollable loss can cause retrograde amnesia. And that's a failure of the brain to capture and encode memory of events that occurred shortly before the loss was recognized. The best a person can do is to try to fill in the blanks. There is no therapy for that. There is no chemical, there's no pharmaceutical therapy that can be used that can try to recreate those memories. The best a person can do is try to fill in the blanks. And I say this with great fondness, but Nancy Brophy is a person who will fill in the blanks. She's a chatterer. That's how her brain works. She is always, always, always filling in the blanks. She will fill that in with words. And you saw that on full display here in the courtroom. The more exhausted she became, the more words filled the space. So there were times that her responses were obviously speculative. She admitted to things, that inculpatory fact, that more accurately, that supposed inculpatory fact, because it wasn't an accurate fact, that she had watched this video, but it was demonstrably untrue. The only point at which she stopped accepting all those facts that were being handed to her really was when she was asked whether she went inside OCI. And then her response in substance was, I cannot imagine that because I cannot imagine that I would have killed my husband. That's just unfathomable. One of our known knowns, or our known unknowns, is how the stress of living in jail has impacted her ability to recall and relate information in her memory banks. It's hard to tell how much she could have accessed 4 years ago, before the sudden loss of her husband, before she was thrown in jail. We also don't know where she is in the process that we're all going through, that none of us really recognize well, but that we all go through with the gradual decrease and diminishment of memory over time. She'll be 72 this month. She's well into the age that even somebody with high acuity may be suffering or starting to experience some imperceptible decreases in memory. There's no question she's a person of high acuity. She obviously is. She's got great social talents. There's no doubt about that. But do those things make her infallible? Does that mean that she can withstand the rigors of what she's been going through for the last 4 years, certainly for the last couple of months? We do have some known knowns, though, about that morning, thanks to the digital forensic experts, both Arthur Hively and Josiah Roloff. We know that she turned on her laptop at 8:31 a.m. It promptly crashed and then rebooted. And then she was able to work on insurance business for a few moments. Oops. You'll see in the exhibits that you have back with you, the defense exhibits 370 and 372 are exhibits from Mr. Hively that show her working on that insurance business after 8:31 in the morning. And they show fairly consistent nonstop activity. And then she turns to her writing. She turns to that Witches trilogy that she'd been so fixated on for that week, that she was racing to finish. And in Defense Exhibit 373, he shows you the proof that that's what she's doing on her computer, that there's a Lexar thumb drive that's plugged in, and then she's working on that for quite some time. She's doing that all in response to the email from the agent that you saw from May 25th. That's Defense Exhibit 209. And you'll have an index to all the exhibits, so it should be pretty easy to find these things. But those all tie together, and they presented all of that evidence to you. And then Mr. Roloff and Mr. Hively both talked with you about the series of phone calls that we've now gone over between Maxine Borcherding and Nancy Brophy, and then Nancy Brophy and Karen Brophy, and then the call from the friend who wants to see whether they can have lunch. All of those things happen in very rapid succession right before she goes down to OCI to talk with the detectives. And so from that, we know now that even though the questioning to Heidi Hutchinson when she testified suggested that she must have been wrong about her timing, and that the detectives who wrote it down as that she must have run into Nancy Brophy sometime after 9 o'clock, that's what she said initially. She said, no, I have a clear memory of this. My daughter had sports practice that morning, and we would have gotten home from that sometime around 7:45 or 7:50 that morning, and we saw Nancy not very long after that. It was right about the time we got home. She must have been right about that, because Mr. Hively tells you that by 8:30, so 45 minutes later, less than 45 minutes later, she's already on her computer. She's already doing work. So she must have succeeded in finding the dogs and gotten them home during that time between 7:45 and 8:30 in the morning. And then that activity is just continuous. Mr. Hively and Mr. Roloff show you that the activity is continuous right up through that 9:54 call from Maxine Borcherding, and then the call, and then she barely has enough time to get herself ready to go down and have this, what she knew by then was likely to be a very painful, difficult interaction with everybody at OCI. So whether or not you're willing to accept the state's judgment, when it has been harsh judgment that's been heaped upon her about the financial choices that she and Dan Brophy made, pursuing their passions rather than acquiring as much money as they could as early in their lives as they could, whether or not you think that you might react differently if you were to experience an event like this, that you would be sobbing in every event, at every turn, whether or not that judgment is something that you can relate to. I want you to think about your responsibility here as jurors in this case, and the standard and the burden of proof, and whether those have anything to do with the way that you have to go about making these decisions. So much of that is really just can't lose for winning, can't win for losing argument. No matter which way she turns, there's going to be a criticism, and it's going to be a harsh criticism. Anything and everything is considered evidence of possible guilt. But that isn't the legal standard. That's not the standard for you to apply. Is it possible she could have done this? The standard you have to hold the state to is beyond a reasonable doubt, that there's no other reasonable possibility that you could reach. And unless you find that they have met that very, very high standard, you cannot return a verdict in the state's favor. Throughout this trial, and certainly today in this courtroom, throughout the state's presentation, the questions and the arguments have all foundered on this idea about whether something was possible. And I understand in a circumstantial case that we tend to do that, just as even though you don't have to find motive, you want to understand motive. Those things go together in a sense. But it has to be significantly more than that. More than whether it's just possible, whether that story makes sense, whether that could hold together, maybe whether that could be true. That kind of thinking stands the standard on its head. If you think there's any reasonable possibility that Nancy Brophy is not guilty, any reasonable possibility, that's the phrase that you need to keep in mind. If there's any reasonable possibility that Nancy Brophy is not guilty, in other words, the possibility goes in her favor, not against her, you must give her the benefit of the doubt. You must return a verdict of not guilty. That's what the law requires. There is no standard for Nancy Brophy to meet. The rules are that the state, and the state alone, has the burden to convince you that events occurred as they contend they occurred. They can't just throw out possibilities and throw out theories and hope that you merely find them more plausible than any other theory. It isn't our job to prove a theory. It isn't our job to prove whether Oscar Taylor had a gun. Those burdens, all of those things, fall to the state to prove. And only if the state has convinced each of you firmly, beyond a reasonable doubt, that there's no other reasonable possibility, can you return a verdict in their favor. Nancy Brophy loved her husband. She loved that man. You could see that in her eyes every time she talked about him. Her eyes lit up. They absolutely twinkled when she was finally able to be out in a courtroom and talk about him. They sparkled. You heard a love story in this courtroom, in this trial. You heard about a love that blossomed each and every day they were together, right up to their very last day together. That love grew and grew and grew, and they were looking so forward to spending the rest of their lives together. Nancy Brophy chooses to be the strong person that she's always been. She's never been one to sob or display that kind of emotion in public. She thinks of herself as somebody who should be strong for others. She prides herself on that. She was raised to be that. Both of her parents were lawyers. You can imagine what that was like. She chooses to remember Dan Brophy in the garden. She chooses to remember him puttering around in their master kitchen. She chooses to remember him, to imagine him, to think forward and create memories of him still being with her, sitting on the porch that they intended to share as they slowed down a little bit. We should all wish for that kind of strength. So I want to close in thanking you again for your patience, your very steady attention that you paid throughout this entire long trial. I know that there were days that were interesting and days that were less so, but all of you were here and focused and present every single day. And that's a remarkable tribute to each of you as individuals, but also really in a social sense. This is a remarkable experience that people can come together and sit and peacefully talk about difficult things and come to a resolution. This has been an important gift that you have given all of the rest of us, and we appreciate that very much. It's also an awesome responsibility to carry with you because our system has provided no safety net for what you do. You are held in such high regard, and rightfully so, that the appellate court won't ever second guess the decision that you make, the factual decisions that you make, because you're the ones who are here in the courtroom with the witnesses. You're the ones who actually see people. You hear them testify. You can watch what they do. You see the complexity of how these pieces fit together. And no appellate judges, no panel of judges reading the transcripts, reading the black and white on the page could ever really take in as much as you've been able to take in. So that means that there isn't a safety net for your decision. You will be the ones who make this decision. If there's a mistake that's been made by one of the professionals in the room, they'll take a look at that. They understand what the mistakes are and how they should respond to those. But the factual decision is yours and yours alone. So having listened to the evidence as carefully as you have, we hope and believe that the conclusion that you'll reach is that the overwhelming majority of the evidence that you have heard does not support the state's version of the facts. That speculative approach, that speculative theory about how the facts might fit together, that might have happened, isn't sufficient. And that instead, the evidence that you've been presented calls very strongly for a verdict of not guilty. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Overstreet, I'm thinking that rebuttal will be tomorrow morning unless you believe it's going to be very quick.
I mean, it will be brief, Your Honor. However, we still have to take down and set up. So
Okay,
I couldn't say we'd finish before 5.
sure. Well, I guess I'll ask, do you think realistically by 5:15 or 5:20 or? Not sure. Okay. All right. I'm gonna then excuse the jury for the day. We'll resume tomorrow at 9 with the state's rebuttal, then final instructions, and then have you break for deliberation.
Okay, we'll go over for